Hello friends, you are welcome to Nationhood Podcast and to episode 2.2, Great Power Politics, Part 2. Last time, we started a discussion about Europe in the 19th century, taking a look at the effect of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars and how they shaped geopolitics in the first 3 decades of the century. In this episode, we will discuss major political events that occurred in the middle third of the 19th century and up to 1884, when the Berlin Conference started. And so, without much more ado, let us begin. We continue our tale in Britain, where Arthur Wellesley, the popular Prime Minister and hero of the Battle of Waterloo, lost control of Parliament because he couldn't yield to calls for parliamentary reform. The same obstinacy with which he beat Napoleon will be the cause of his downfall. It is safe to say that as of 1830, Britain had advanced closer to democracy than the other great powers of Europe. Still, it is nowhere close to what is in practice today. What Britain had was not popular representation, but propertied representation. This made voting inaccessible for most people. Lord Grey, Wellington's replacement as Prime Minister, accepted the appointment on the singular condition that a bill for parliamentary reform would be introduced. Grey belonged to the Whig Party, but his government was a coalition that included breakaway factions of Wellington's Tory party. After 2 failed attempts, the Grey government passed a reform bill in 1832 that reduced representational redundancy and created 67 new constituencies. The bill expanded the franchise qualification in the counties to include small landowners, tenant farmers and shopkeepers, and it extended voting rights to householders and lodgers paying an annual rent of £10 in the boroughs. In reality, the qualifications for obtaining the franchise still excluded the majority of working class men, and women were completely exempted. This is strange because before the reform bill became an act, some women with property could vote. For all its supposed progressiveness, the Reform Act of 1832 created more unrest and satisfaction amongst the British working classes. They started to organize politically, and in 1838, under the auspices of the London Working Men's Association, released a set of demands designed to counter the property requirements for voting or being voted for. This movement became known as Chartism because their 6-point demand was described as the People's Charter. The Charter requested universal manhood suffrage, meaning the extension of voting rights to all men above 21, and the adoption of secret ballots to prevent intimidation, bribery, and corruption. The third demand was that the parliamentary elections should be held every year, as this would ensure accountability from elected officials. The Charter proposed the creation of equal electoral districts to eliminate the domination of individuals with large property holdings over tiny districts. To further democratize membership of the Commons, the Charter also demanded that members of Parliament should be paid the significant sum of £500 per annum. This would enable working class men to stand for election and not have to worry about their livelihoods or be susceptible to corruption or undue influence. Finally, the Charter demanded that the property qualification for contesting a seat to the Commons should be abolished. The movement was popular and garnered 1,250,000 signatures before it was presented to Parliament in 1839, but the ideas were so radical, the Charter was rejected. The rejection of the Charter by Parliament led to significant unrest which the authorities moved to crush. In 1842, the Charter was presented again, this time with the support of 3 million votes. Once again, it was rejected and resulted in further unrest, which the authorities had to crush again. When revolution broke out on most of continental Europe in 1848, a third and final attempt was made to present the Charter to Parliament, but this was also rejected. This time, soldiers had been deployed to quash the expected unrest, but surprisingly, nothing happened. After a decade of unsuccessful agitation, the Chartist movement eventually fizzled out. However, its legacy was tangible. In 1867, a second Reform Act doubled the number of voting men from 1 million to 2 million by reducing the property requirement in counties and granting the votes to all householders and lodgers paying a rent of £10 per annum in the boroughs. However, property remained the primary qualification for getting the franchise. A third Reform Act was passed in 1884. This time, a uniform franchise was established for the whole country, creating parity between requirements for voters in counties as in boroughs. This had the effect of extending the vote to 60% of eligible men, but all women were still excluded. Hence, the 19th century was a period when Britain made much progress towards becoming a system of government based on popular representation, but it still had a long way to go. On the continent, popular sovereignty was even less common. Republican governments existed in some tiny and geopolitically inconsequential places that were no larger than counties or cities, such as the Swiss cantons or the German city-states like Frankfurt. Similar to Britain, other constitutional monarchies existed with similar problems over the source of sovereignty. In France, for instance, eligibility to vote was also based on property, and only 5% of the adult male population met the requirements. As in Britain, women were also excluded. Thus, although France was a constitutional monarchy, its legislature did not reflect or represent the general population. Similar constitutional monarchies existed in Netherlands, Belgium, and Norway, as well as some West and South German states. Both absolute and constitutional monarchs relied on ministers to handle the daily business of government, and these ministers typically came from the nobility or the upper class. You may have noticed how Wellington was a duke, and he was replaced by Grey, who was a lord. The ministry appointed by the monarch constituted what we consider today as the executive arm of government, and members of the executive would come from the legislature or the civil service. Constitutional monarchies usually had a bicameral legislature, that is, 2 legislative houses. Election to the lower house was based on property qualifications, which we have already discussed, while membership of the upper house was usually hereditary and restricted to the nobility and other dignitaries, such as senior ranks of the clergy. In Britain, the lower and upper houses were respectively called the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The difference between Britain's constitutional monarchy and what could be found in continental Europe was that whereas the British legislature held and guarded its rights to approve the monarch's plans and policies, in Europe, the legislature were often treated as rubber stamps for the monarch's plans. Their right to legislate was not secure. Also expected within the framework of constitutional monarchy was the existence of an independent judiciary, or at least the appearance of it. In addition, constitutional monarchies espouse some of the rights that are a staple of democracies today, such as the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, and freedom of religion. Here again, Britain was ahead of the other constitutional monarchies in continental Europe. As limited as these freedoms were in the constitutional monarchies, they were even less apparent in the absolute monarchies. In Austria, Prussia, and the Italian states, the powers of the monarchs were virtually unchecked. Although the absolute monarchs also appointed ministers and operated through a civil service, the ability to restrain the abuses that came with absolutism were limited. Consequently, the commoners not only lacked the means to express themselves, but no provision was made for rights such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of association, which were common levers for expressing discontent. Indeed, the people were simply subjects who were expected to obey the dictates of the monarch and their agents. But does this mean that life was necessarily better in constitutional monarchies than in absolutist states? The answer probably depends on whom you ask. One thing is certain though, as of the mid-19th century, the civil liberties enjoyed in today's liberal democracies were not guaranteed, regardless of the system under which one lived. Political representation was marginally better in constitutional states, but common folk were still largely left out of the equation. Also, repression in absolutist regimes did not mean that political action or opposition completely disappeared. Marginalization combined with economic disasters through the mid-1940s to spread popular unrest across Europe. In France, the July monarchy of Louis-Philippe gradually turned away from its liberal origins to a more conservative stance, perhaps because he was still a Bourbon. More importantly, calls for universal manhood suffrage fell on deaf ears and was defeated by France's elitist parliament. In the Papal States, Pope Pius showed a liberal spirit by holding elections for a consultative assembly in 1847, but returned to his conservative roots by rejecting the assembly's calls for a constitution because sovereignty came from God. It was a stalemate. Also in 1847, King Frederick Wilhelm IV of Prussia composed a diet from regional assemblies to approve new taxes to fix his regime's finances. The diet demanded a constitution in return, but the king promptly rejected the idea. He could not allow a constitution to come between God and country. With no sign of progress, the king dissolved the Diet because he refused to approve new taxes if he would not grant the constitution. Here again was a stalemate. And so, faced with food shortages, a recession, and financial crisis caused by a run of poor harvests, as well as governments unwilling to reform or make concessions, but in reality, too financially unstable to suppress opposition, the crisis boiled over in 1848. Jonathan Sperber has argued that the revolutions that followed were not only inevitable, but also expected. This is how he summarizes the revolutions of 1848. The first one that successfully toppled the monarch happened in January on the Italian peninsula when Ferdinand II, King of the Two Sicilies, succumbed to the demands of insurgents and agreed to implement a constitution, civil rights, and also to call elections. The next place was France, where in February, street demonstrations escalated to clashes with soldiers who were ultimately unwilling to shoot at the rioters. Seeing that he had lost the use of force, King Louis Philippe fled Paris for Britain. The rioters converged on Parliament and forced them to declare France a republic. The successful revolt in France inspired the people in the German states to rise up against their own governments. In Berlin, capital of Prussia, and Vienna, capital of Austria, similar demonstrations led the monarchs to dismiss their conservative ministers and appoint liberals instead. The biggest loser here was Austrian Chancellor Metternich, who had acted as the guardian of absolutism since 1815. The Habsburg court would flee, and Metternich would also end up in London. The provisional governments established in Austria's non-German dominions of Venice, Milan, and Hungary went further to declare their independence from Austria. In Denmark and the Netherlands, the monarchs conceded to liberal reforms that included adopting a constitution. Belgium was already a constitutional monarchy, but representation was limited because of property qualifications. The demonstrations there were scattered by government forces, but it also introduced reforms that lowered the property qualifications and grew the electorate by 70%. In Sweden, whose king also ruled over Norway, the demonstrations were repressed and no serious changes were made in either country. Interestingly, although they shared a ruler, Sweden had an absolutist government, while Norway was a constitutional regime with franchise based on property. As discussed in the last episode, Spain had already been through a long period of revolutionary changes, and so there was no appetite for one in 1848. In Eastern Europe, the Prince of Moldavia succeeded in suppressing revolutionaries, while the Prince of Wallachia failed to contain those in his realm, and they went on to form a new government. The only great powers untouched by the wave of revolutions were Britain and Russia. Let me state here that the overview I've provided is a heavily summarized version of events that are loaded with details. However, my objective is only to sketch outlines of the changes that were happening in Europe in 1848. One thing I observed was that the liberal reforms each state adopted was relative to their pre-revolutionary position. For example, constitutional monarchies like France and Belgium went further along the spectrum of liberalism by respectively proclaiming a republic and expanding the pool of the qualified electorate, while the absolute monarchies took on a variety of liberal reforms, including the adoption of constitutions, the appointment of liberal ministers, and the conduct of elections. In other words, the have-nots wanted to have, and the haves wanted to have more. But for France, all these countries retained their monarchs. By mid-1848, the revolutions had reached a peak. In one form or the other, political participation was no longer the exclusive preserve of the elites, as absolutism gave way to parliamentarism, and parliamentarism paved the way for republicanism. Nationalism was ascendant, while elections and civil liberties were introduced in places where hitherto they did not exist. But Sperber points out some issues the revolutions did not resolve. For example, there were questions of whether reformers should aim for constitutional monarchy with a franchise based on property or a republic based on universal manhood suffrage, and even so, who constituted a man, just males or females as well. Another issue was the question of what constituted a nation, and by extension, what national self-determination meant. The Italian peninsula comprised of independent entities like the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies and the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia, as well as dominions under Austrian control, such as the Lombardo-Venetian Kingdom, which wanted to join the independent Italian states to form a united Italy. The formation of a united Germany was also proposed, but the big question was, under whose leadership would it be? Austria, which was president of the German Confederation, or Prussia, with whom Austria was engaged in a perpetual struggle for ascendancy and dominion of Central Europe. The Kingdom of Hungary formed a significant chunk of the Austrian Empire and wanted independence badly. But Hungarian authority was also challenged by its own ethnic minorities which wanted their own nations. Hence, questions of political reform were not resolved by the revolutions of 1848, but it was a year of reckoning during which Europeans extensively explored questions of nationhood. The fortunes of the revolutionary started to reverse in the same place where it first gained traction. That is, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, located in the southern part of the Italian peninsula. In response to demands by radical members of parliament for the kingdom's army to go and support northern Italian states fighting for independence from Austria, King Ferdinand sent his troops to the capital in Naples to intimidate the opposition in parliament. In protest, the liberal ministers in his government resigned, and he seized the opportunity to appoint conservatives who were more likely to pursue his goals. However, he did not restore the pre-revolutionary state of absolutism. The best view of the reversal suffered by Europe's revolutionaries can be obtained by looking at the counter-revolutions in Austria and Prussia. By August 1848, Austria had suppressed the revolts in its northern Italian provinces. When rebellion broke out there, the rebels were backed by the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, who took advantage of the situation to declare war on Austria. The resulting conflict became known as the First War of Italian Independence. And even though the Austrian forces were initially disorganized, the army of Piedmont-Sardinia bungled its opportunity and lost. Thus, Austria crushed the aspiration of Italian nationalists who were seeking unity and independence. Earlier in June, the Austrian army had crushed the rebel government that emerged in Prague, the capital of Austria's Bohemian territories. The only place where the pre-revolutionary status of the empire had yet to be restored was Hungary. First, Austrian forces from its Croatian territories engaged the Hungarian army in late September, but they were beaten back by early October. When the monarchy tried to send imperial forces from Vienna to support the Croatians, the soldiers mutinied, and this was followed by a second revolt in the city, forcing the monarch and his courts to flee a second time. This was a crisis for the Austrian monarchy. The Croatian army then changed its objective from conquering Hungary to reclaiming Vienna from the rebels. In a reversal of fortunes, whereas the imperial troops had originally been directed from Vienna to conquer the rebel government's forces in Hungary, the insurgents in Vienna now called on the Hungarian army to defend it from the Austrian government troops, which combined Croatian forces with the army from Prague. By the end of October, the Austrian government forces had regained control of Vienna. Liberal ministers were forced to resign, and they were replaced with absolutists. Also, Emperor Ferdinand, who suffered from mental illness, was forced to abdicate in favor of his nephew, Franz Joseph. Most importantly, the Constituent Assembly was rendered redundant as a de facto state of absolutism was restored. For the people of Austria, the events of 1848 had implications far beyond whether the government was liberal or absolutist in nature. The Austrian Empire was a patchwork of ethnic nationalities, including Italians in southern Europe, Magyars in Hungary to the east of Austria, Slavic people to the north and northeast of Austria, consisting of Czechs, Slovaks, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Ukrainians, and the Latin Romanians, as well as the predominant Germans of Austria itself. Consequently, the ethnic leanings of these different groups came to the fore when the liberal regimes that took over after the monarchy fell subscribed to the proposal of holding elections for a German National Assembly that would sit in Frankfurt with delegates from all across the German Confederation. The problem here was that Austria's ethnic minorities refused to be identified as German, so the question was, how would they be represented in the German Confederation? To make it worse, in Austrian territories like Hungary, where Romanians, Slovaks, Serbs and Croatians were minorities, nationalism was a function of ethnicity, not of existence within the Kingdom of Hungary. Thus, when the Hungarian Diet switched from Latin to Magyar as the language of legislative proceedings, delegates from Croatia continued to speak Latin. Similarly, the Hungarian province of Croatia-Slavonia resisted the arrangement of using Magyar by adopting Croatian for its own proceedings. If the Hungarian Diet sent official correspondence to the province in Magyar, it received a response in Latin or Croatian. On his part, King Frederick Wilhelm IV of Prussia watched the events in Austria with keen interest. The victory of the Austrian royal court over the forces of revolution spurred him to take actions he had long considered but did not act on. He wanted to get rid of the liberals in his government and Prussia's Constituent Assembly, which was aggressively pressing for a transition to a constitutional monarchy. With the success of Austria serving as inspiration, Friedrich Wilhelm dismissed his liberal prime minister, General Pfuel, and appointed Count Brandenburg in his place. Under the pretext of safeguarding the assembly from a potential Republican uprising, Brandenburg moved 50,000 troops into the capital, Berlin. In reality, this was a coup that sacked the assembly, who were sufficiently frightened. The capital succumbed to this show of force without a fuss, but some skirmishes between the army and protesters ensued in some provinces. However, the army prevailed. Subsequently, Prime Minister Brandenburg dismissed the Constituent Assembly and issued a constitution by decree. Hence, he used the instrumentality of a constitution to enhance royal power while moving away from a completely absolutist government. So, what has just happened? The short answer is, even though 1848 started on a very positive note for liberals, by the end of the year, the absolutists were back in control. Perhaps the biggest irony was France, which progressed from a constitutional monarchy to a republic. It held elections in December 1848 and elected Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the other Bonaparte, as president, partly due to his uncle's legacy and partly due to his own personality. Louis Napoleon was popular with the masses, but as president, he started appointing monarchists to his government and implementing a conservative program. In 1851, he seized power, declaring himself president for life, and then, in 1852, Emperor of the French. In effect, Emperor Napoleon III, as he became known, reversed the liberal gains made in France within 4 years. If revolutionary fervor did not infect Britain and Russia in 1848, it would seem that neither of them could prevent war fever, and the carrier of this infection was the Ottoman Empire. Tsar Nicholas described the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe because political and economic instability were accelerating its decline and likely disintegration. Russia and the Ottoman Empire shared a history of antagonism which had been exacerbated in the 19th century by the question of Greek independence. On this matter, Russia's 1828 campaign against the Turks was supported by an Anglo-French coalition, leading to defeat for the Ottoman Empire in 1829. A quarter century later, in 1854, another Anglo-French coalition jumped into a conflict between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, but this time it was to support the Turks. Nominally, the problem was caused by Tsar Nicholas's insistence that Russia had the right to defend Christians living in Ottoman dominions, which included Jerusalem. In reality, he sought to subordinate Ottomans to Russian authority and thus greatly expand Russia's great power status. Neither the British nor the French could abide this situation. The Sultan rejected the Tsar's ultimatum to become a Russian protectorate in May 1853, after which Nicholas sent forces to occupy Moldavia and Wallachia. That October, the Sultan declared war on Russia, and 6 months later, Britain and France entered the fray on the Turkish side. This did not surprise Tsar Nicholas, but he was truly shocked when Austria, Russia's main European ally, not only refused to support him, but threatened to join the Anglo-French coalition. Nicholas was particularly hurt by Austria's move because, after Hungary declared independence in 1849 and achieved a number of military victories over the weak Austrian army, he had sent Russian forces to Emperor Franz Josef's aid. Montefiore notes in his Chronicle of the Romanov dynasty that Tsar Nicholas turned a portrait of Franz Josef to the wall and inscribed the word "ingrate" on the back. Although Nicholas eventually withdrew his forces from the Ottoman territories of Moldavia and Wallachia, it was too late to avert war. The Anglo-French coalition was determined to crush Russian power in the Black Sea, where the Crimean Peninsula was located. Russia had annexed Crimea from the Ottomans in 1774, and Crimea would lend its name to the looming confrontation. After initial naval battles, the Crimean War commenced in September 1854. Some historians have accused the Anglo-French coalition of prosecuting a poor campaign due to bad organization. Fortunately, their Russian adversaries were even more inept. They were worse equipped, and they were under the bungling command of the aging Prince Menshikov. In the end, the industrial might of the coalition provided the technology and wealth that overwhelmed Russia. Tsar Nicholas fell ill in January 1855 and passed away in February, leaving the prosecution of the Crimean War to his son and heir, Alexander II. The new Tsar tried his best to carry on, but suffered more defeats. In August, the Italian kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia joined the coalition and with French troops smashed an attacking Russian force of 57,000 on the Chernaya River. More defeats would follow. Alexander finally threw in the towel in January 1856 after Austria sent an ultimatum, and it seemed Sweden was also set to join the Allies. At the Treaty of Paris hosted by Napoleon III that March, Russia was forced to surrender Bessarabia, a region on the Black Sea that it had wrested from the Ottomans earlier in the 19th century. More critically, it was forced to surrender its Black Sea fortifications and lost the right to station a navy there. This left an important Russian coastline as well as commercial interests of Russia vulnerable to Britain. Three important and related things stand out from the Crimean War. The first is that Russia was no longer the great power it had been since 1815. Nicholas held delusional visions about Russian grandeur. He had failed to key Russia into the Industrial Revolution, and when his ill-equipped army, antiquated bureaucracy, and agrarian economy squared up against the industrially advanced and militarily sophisticated British and French, his illusions came crashing down. Secondly, the Ottoman Empire, which had been in a state of decline, was admitted to great power status, and its territorial integrity was guaranteed at the Treaty of Paris. However, its actual role in bringing about Russia's defeat was nominal, and in reality, its newfound prominence was dependent on Anglo-French support, which would subsequently be tested and prove to be unreliable. Finally, the support of Austria for the Allies would end the enmity of Russia, which would play an active role in its own loss of prominence and the rise of Prussia as a leading German state and power broker in Central Europe. Soon enough, Austria would confront its own geopolitical nightmares. When Piedmont Sardinia joined the Crimean War on the side of the Allies in 1855, it was laying the groundwork that would guarantee Italian independence. The Piedmontese bureaucrats believed that if the despotism of absolutism was to be dealt a decisive blow, then Russia needed to be humbled. We have discussed how Russia and Austria were bulwarks against liberal movements in Europe. As it was already a constitutional monarchy, Piedmont believed that an alliance with Britain and France would be useful for its plans to liberate the Italian states under Austrian rule and influence, and then unite the Italian peninsula into a single nation. At the Treaty of Paris, Piedmont sent its chief minister, that is, Prime Minister, named Count Cavour, as its delegate. Although Piedmont was in northern Italy, Cavour took the opportunity to discuss how unhappy Italians were in the Papal States and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. These were respectively in central and southern Italy, and both were independent but under Austrian influence. With Russia weakened as a great power and the French firmly in their corner, King Victor Emmanuel of Piedmont Sardinia and his chief minister, Count Cavour, declared war on Austria in 1859. This was the Second War of Italian independence. Piedmont demanded independence for the northern Italian provinces of Lombardy and Venetia, and they promised that Austria would no longer interfere in the affairs of the Italian peninsula, meaning the Papal States in central Italy and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in southern Italy. It is unlikely that Piedmont Sardinia on its own could stand up against Austria, but French support made the difference. The Austrians withdrew from northern Italy, creating room for the unification of Piedmont Sardinia with the northern Italian state of Lombardy, as well as the central Italian states of Tuscany, Modena, Parma, and Romagna. The enlarged dominion of Piedmont Sardinia became known as the Kingdom of Italy, but it still did not include the Papal States or the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. The Two Sicilies was a kingdom ruled by a branch of the Bourbon dynasty, and it was a close ally of Austria. In 1860, an uprising led by Giuseppe Garibaldi toppled the Sicilian Bourbons, paving the way for the unification of Italy under the rule of the Piedmontese king, Victor Emmanuel. The unification process also swallowed up the Papal States, drawing muted protests from across Europe. But none of this mattered because the British were in full support of an independent and united Italy, while France was happy because it gained some territory in the process, including Monaco and Nice. On his part, Tsar Alexander of Russia was delighted with Austria's disgrace. With Russia posing a threat on its eastern flank, Austria's position was considerably weakened as it fought the French and Piedmontese in the west. It would not be the last time Russia would eagerly pose a threat to an embattled Austria. This was revenge for Austria's behavior during the Crimean War, straight from the freezer. The next opportunity did not take long to arrive. In fact, it was inspired by the unification of Italy. As you would recall, Austria was the president of the German Confederation, a loose association of German states created at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. The Confederation was somewhat similar to the Holy Roman Empire, which was also led by Austria until it was dissolved by Napoleon in 1806. However, the Confederation included another powerful German state, Prussia, with whom Austria shared a long history of rivalry. As the Italian War of Independence raged, Austria tried to drag the Confederation into the struggle, but Prussia resisted the move, contributing to Austria's inability to keep Lombardy under its control. The achievement of Italian unity stirred nationalist feelings among the German states, who now sought a closer union. There seemed to be a consensus that Prussia should lead a united Germany, but there was a question of what to do about Austria. One group of nationalists wanted to exclude Austria completely from a united Germany. This is likely because the Austrian Empire consisted of many non-German nationalities like the Magyars of Hungary and the Slavic people of Bohemia. On the other hand, a different group insisted that a united Germany could not be complete if it did not at the minimum include the German-speaking parts of Austria. In 1862, King Wilhelm I of Prussia promoted his ambassador to Russia, Otto von Bismarck, to the position of Prime Minister, or Minister-President as is contained in some records. Bismarck was a ruthless and energetic leader that worked hard on the king's plan to convert the Prussian army into an excellent fighting machine. Bismarck was determined to use the army to solve the problem of German unity, declaring once in the Prussian parliament that the only solution lay in blood and iron. In 1864, Prussia and Austria jointly fought against Denmark to take control of Schleswig-Holstein, a Danish territory where most of the population were ethnic Germans. However, once the conquered territory had been split between them, Prussia and Austria turned on each other, and war between them seemed inevitable. The next year, Schleswig was placed under Prussian administration, and Austria was made responsible for Holstein. This was intended to avoid war, but neither party was satisfied. Prussia wanted to fully annex Schleswig, while Austria was opposed to this and wanted both territories to be handed over to the Duke of Augustenburg, the rightful heir by succession. Prussia was having none of it, and in 1866 it signed a pact with Italy, which agreed that it would support Prussia if it declared war against Austria. On its part, Austria tried to mobilize the Confederacy against Prussia, which it accused of warmongering. It has been argued that the Austro-Prussian War was less about the dispute over Schleswig-Holstein and more about the centuries-old struggle between the two German powers for supremacy. For most of the period, Austria had been the dominant power, but with the rise of Prussia, the question needed to be settled once and for all. After initial skirmishes, the Prussians won the decisive battle at Königgrätz on July 3, 1866, and subsequently routed the Austrian army at Tobischau on July 15th. At the Peace of Prague, where the dispute was settled, Austria was permanently barred from ever being a part of Germany and forced to give up any claim to Schleswig-Holstein, in addition to having to pay a huge war indemnity of 20 million thalers, the currency used by German states at the time. The German states which had supported Austria came to terms with Prussia, and while the South German states remained independent, the northern states united to form the North German Confederation, with Prussia as its leader. The rise of Prussia did not go unnoticed by the other powers. France in particular was anxious to prevent a complete unification of Germany under Prussia. Similar to the territorial concessions it drew from Piedmont, Sardinia during Italian unification, she demanded compensation, but was rebuffed by Prussia. The initial tension passed after some diplomatic maneuvering that resulted in Luxembourg being separated from Germany but being recognized as an independent and neutral state by all the great powers in 1867. The historical records seem to suggest that both France and Prussia wanted war. The opportunity presented itself in 1870 when Leopold, a cousin of King Wilhelm of Prussia, was offered the throne of Spain by the Spanish government. Alarmed that another great power was trying to play in its backyard, France vigorously objected, and Leopold agreed to forego his candidacy for the Spanish throne, even though he was entitled by heredity. As though this were not enough, the French asked the ambassador to Prussia to approach King Wilhelm and demand that the Spanish offer would never be accepted. This request was made openly to further embarrass the king. He rejected it. For the French, Wilhelm's rejection was a call for war that could not be ignored. Bismarck, however, was delighted with this turn of events. He desired to teach the French a lesson, but wanted the declaration of war to come from Paris, not Berlin. It arrived on July 19th, and the Germans were ready for the French. In the battles that followed, the supposedly modern French army that had outclassed the Russians in the Crimean War and provided the backbone to the Italians in the War of Independence from Austria turned out to be no match for the Prussians. In a campaign that was swift and efficient, Prussia utterly defeated France. At the Battle of Sedan on September 1st, 1870, Emperor Napoleon was taken prisoner along with 50 generals, 5,000 other officers, and 84,000 soldiers. They also took possession of all French equipment. Interestingly, the people of France did not give up the fight. Instead, they formed a government of national defense, which forced the Germans to besiege Paris. After 4 months of resistance, Paris finally capitulated on January 28, 1871, accepting peace terms that were humiliating. France was handed a war indemnity of 5 billion francs, and also forced to give up its territories in Alsace-Lorraine, which, similar to Schleswig-Holstein, was majorly populated by German-speaking people. The loss of the war and the subsequent peace arrangements were shattering blows to French prestige as a great power in Europe. For Prussia, it was a glorious moment. Just as the war with Austria had changed the balance of power in Germany, the war with France had changed the balance of power in Europe. Prussia was the undisputed master of the continent. During the course of the war, the independent states of southern Germany united with the Northern Confederation, all under the leadership of Prussia. And so it was that on January 18, 1871, at the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, King Wilhelm of Prussia was proclaimed Emperor of the United Germany with the title Kaiser. Just like his nephew and ally, the Tsar of Russia, he now claimed the heritage of Caesar, from which both titles derive. Russia was one of the beneficiaries of the Franco-Prussian War. It had promised to cover Prussia's eastern flank from Austria. In return, Prussia promised to release Russia from the treaty obligations it was bound to after losing the Crimean War. True to its word, Prussia helped Russia to revoke the ban on its fortifications in the Black Sea, leading Tsar Alexander to declare, "The stone that oppressed my heart for 15 years has just been lifted." By 1877, Russia was at war with Turkey again. The main cause of trouble was the oppressive treatment of Slavic people by the Ottoman government, which, in 1875, led to a nationalist revolution in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Because Russians shared ethnic and religious bonds with the Slavs of the Ottoman Empire, it attempted to mediate. Other European powers also tried to intervene, notably Austria, France, Italy, and, reluctantly, Britain. Negotiations failed in January 1877, and Russia declared war on the Ottomans that April. This time, the Ottomans did not enjoy the support they got during the Crimean War. After fighting some spirited battles, they eventually surrendered in November 1877. This war was a significant loss for the Ottoman Empire, as they had to give up much territory. At the Treaty of San Stefano of April 1878, it was forced to grant independence to Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, as well as semi-autonomous status to Bulgaria. Russia itself regained Bessarabia, which it had lost after Crimea, as well as the Ottoman territories of Kars, Batum, and Ardahan on the Black Sea. Britain, however, intervened to ensure Russia did not overextend its power, and in doing so, it gained administrative rights over Cyprus, while Austria was granted similar control of Bosnia and Herzegovina. This peace arrangement would be confirmed at the Congress of Berlin in June 1878. There are many more stories about the struggle for power, nationhood, and independence in Europe that we can talk about. But by now, I'm sure you have a clearer picture of how geopolitics unfolded in Europe in the 19th century. Over the course of the last 2 episodes, we have discussed the origins of many nations you are familiar with and how they inherited their present form. Each of these countries is unique and has a rich history that can, and in many cases, have formed the main contents of other podcasts. So, what I have done here is to outline the key events leading to their emergence. You must have identified some common themes. For instance, most of Europe was ruled by monarchs for much of the 19th century, and even when they began to introduce liberal reforms, it was only piecemeal. A second and related similarity is that European countries shared a nationalist spirit that prompted several rebellions against the despotic rule of absolute monarchs in the 19th century. The most famous year being 1848, even though it ended the same way it started, with the monarchs back at the helm of affairs. Still, the constant revolts, uprisings, revolutions, insurrections, and rebellions of the century made it clear to the monarchs that some change was required. Hence, absolutism gradually gave way to constitutional monarchies, which eventually led to republics. A final theme of great power politics in the 19th century is that we have seen great power politics at play. France kicked off the century as the most formidable power in Europe as it conquered the continent in the wake of the 1789 and 1793 revolutions. After Napoleon Bonaparte's empire was conquered, it was readmitted to the Committee of Nations as a means of balancing the power of the other great powers. Austria and Russia would then take center stage, wielding the big stick over nations during the concept of Europe era. No major geopolitical crisis will rock the continent until the Crimean War, when Britain and France held the mirror up for Russia, which was hurt by Austria's backstabbing. It would extract its pound of flesh from the Austrians, who first lost control of Italy and then helplessly watched the remarkable rise of Prussia, who then brought about the ignominious fall of France. But what about Britain, you may ask? Well, Britain is somewhat different because it was separated from the mainland. In terms of military power, its focus in the 19th century was building and maintaining the most powerful navy in the world, and it did that successfully. And though it also had a formidable land force, this was not its typical area of strength. Regardless, Britain remained the only great power that was not conquered by any other great power in the 19th century. One area I would like to touch on briefly is how European geopolitics interfaced with Africa around the mid-19th century. By this time, Europeans had developed a system of colonies in the New World, that is, the Americas. They also had colonies in Asia. The leading colonizing countries were Britain, France, and the Netherlands. One man who badly wanted to get in on the game of establishing colonies was King Leopold II of Belgium, and he saw Africa as his only bet. As Crown Prince of Belgium, he had developed visions of how owning a colony could shoot his country to greatness. In 1864, he traveled to the British colonies of Sri Lanka, India, and Burma, as well as to the Dutch East Indies to study them. Another reason Leopold wanted a colony was to preserve absolutism. In a colony, he would not have to deal with a parliament in the same way liberalism was engaging European monarchs and forcing them to reckon with the aspirations of their people. In 1876, Leopold hosted and chaired a geographical conference in Brussels that attracted the leading explorers of the day from across Europe. Of the 37 delegates, 13 were Belgian and the other 24 were foreigners, such as the Frenchman Marquis de Compagnie, who had traversed the Ogowe River in Gabon, and the German Gerald Rolfs, who circumcised himself to pass for a Muslim in parts of the Sahara. Leopold told attendees that the objective of the conference was to define trade routes to the interior of Africa, to identify suitable locations for establishing trading bases, to set up a system for abolishing slave trade, and to ensure peace among African chiefs. Here, Leopold was essentially laying the groundwork for what is now described with the umbrella term, the civilizing mission. In time, it will prove that the civilizing mission had different interpretations, many of which were very unsavory, to say the least. Leopold recruited the explorer Henry Morton Stanley in 1879 to help him secure the territory that would eventually become the Congo, at the heart of Africa. Stanley worked hard for 5 years, signing treaties with local chiefs that granted sovereignty of their land to Leopold. The chiefs were deceived into thinking that they were signing friendship agreements, not knowing that they were agreeing to give up their lands and to work as labor for the Europeans who were coming to colonize them. If they knew, they would never have agreed, and if it was inevitable, then perhaps colonialism would have had to proceed in a different way. The land secured in this manner would be Leopold's personal kingdom, where despotism would reach its heights. The template he defined and refined would also be seen at play in other parts of Africa. We will discuss these events more, but I have raised them here to point out that by 1884, when other European powers were interested in gaining a firm foothold in Africa and beating the competition while at it, Leopold was well ahead of the game. Thus, when Bismarck convened the Berlin Conference that November, Little Belgium was arguably one of the best, if not the best prepared. The geopolitical history of Europe in the 19th century was largely about the efforts of Britain, France, Prussia, Austria, and Russia to mediate their relations with themselves and smaller European countries. There were many reasons for disputes, not least of which were calls for the enthronement of liberal ideas, epitomized by nationalism and democracy. Broadly speaking, the relative strengths of the powers rose and fell while they managed divergent interests and guiding principles. Overall, Each was keen to maintain an orderly society within its territories while expanding its sphere of influence on the continent and outside of it. But if the political class held a tight grip on this sphere of European life, their grip on social life was less certain. And so, next time, we will move away from geopolitics to discuss some of the sociocultural ideas that gained popularity in Europe during the era. Ideas that not only motivated people to approach politics differently, but also served to broaden their worldviews. This was not only an age of political revolutions, but it was also an age of cultural and industrial revolution.